It's my pleasure to introduce tonight our Saturday evening speaker. He will probably need very, very little introduction to any of you. He's had a remarkable career, if I might say so, a very diverse one. He's worked for a number of commercial television stations, the channels, even worked for the ABC for a period. But he has, I can assure you, redeemed himself in practically every respect. He started his career very modestly in an old-fashioned way, unlike many journalists today, by working for a country newspaper in Renmark. He's worked as a senior political advisor. He's worked as a chief of staff for very senior politicians. And as you know, he's a columnist, he's an editor, he is also an author, and he is a man who appears regularly on television. I doubt whether there's anybody in this audience who has not seen him, who does not respect him, and indeed does not admire him. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Chris Kenny.
Thanks so much, Ian. Really appreciate that. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank Eddie for asking me along, and particularly recognise Ian as the president of the Samuel Griffith Society. I was a great admirer of Ian's when he sat on the highest judicial body in our land back before it had been reduced to a candidate review committee and perhaps a passport control centre. But it's wonderful to be here and wonderful to meet you, Ian. I've flown all the way across the country today to speak to a bunch of constitutional conservatives, and I ducked down into the bar this afternoon, saw some of you there, and the place is called Fenians. And strangely enough, I bumped into a man I know quite well from various roles, but he's currently the Chancellor of the University of South Australia, Jim McDowell, and he comes from Northern Ireland. And he's an Orangeman. Don't you just love Australia? You don't need to tear down statues and spray paint them and change inscriptions. We get along pretty fine as things are. This is the first time I've spoken to a gathering in Perth. Someone once said, follow the money, and from most of the Federation, if you follow the money, this is where you end up, in Western Australia. I've long been a sceptic of the United Nations, and I've got a funny feeling I'll have a few fellow travellers in this room. They are. I've always been deeply worried, if not sceptical, moving on to a deep sense of concern when we look at the United Nations and the way people, through our parliaments, try and impose the international treaty obligations on our political sphere, but never in all the years I've been watching these events did I realise we had the United Nations in the Senate. And all of this, I think, underscores the foresight of our founding fathers, the fact that our Constitution demands undivided loyalty of our politicians is, I think, a very, very sensible one. It was then and it is now. So I was going to open up tonight by doing something that's quite unusual for me. Don't normally do this, but I want to recognise our Indigenous people and the land we share with them. This land, this wonderful, great southern land, unites us as Australians. We all love this land. Indigenous people were here first, of course. Their descendants are among us. And I cherish that. I think that enriches us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And I think the way that we share the spoils of this nation, govern people fairly, balancing the competing needs of the founding colonies. All this has happened, of course, because of the insight and toil of people like Samuel Griffith, who delivered us a masterful constitution. This continent, these peoples under this constitution are really all that we've become. That's who we are. As Prime Minister Julia Gillard once said, we are us. Now, when she said that, I felt like being the guy in Life of Brian down the back saying, I'm not. But we know what she meant. We are a collection of people sharing a continent under this great constitution. We've inherited British traditions, we've adopted Indigenous words and ways, and those of many other cultures as well. And we've done it bloody well. Not perfectly by any stretch, nothing's perfect, but we've shared this continent and these people very well. In a way, in my view, our constitution is an amalgamation of 6 peoples. 6 colonies with 6 different groups came together in this constitution. And with each colony treating Indigenous Australians or Aborigines differently, Indigenous people they weren't left out, but they were kind of left in no man's land. So just let me spruik for a moment this model for Indigenous recognition. I know some of you are onto this already. I was talking to John Stone earlier. He said, oh, you're not into all these land rights and things. I said, hang on a second. I spruiked this model at a quadrant dinner not 2 months ago, and you challenged me then. Yes. Well, John said John said he hated it so much he'd wiped it from his memory. The eternal sunshine of the spotless mind and all that. But the point you've got to remember, and don't worry those who disagree, and some of you already accosted me in the foyer, I'm going to say some stuff later on other issues you'll agree with. But the point about this Indigenous voice model is that it was conceived and designed by constitutional conservatives, and then it was refined and embraced by Noel Pearson and other Indigenous leaders. It might be embraced by this room because it avoids any additional preamble which could be open to over-interpretation. It deliberately rejects the restricted Bill of Rights implications of a racial non-discrimination clause. It protects the Constitution. It is actually a conservative option. When I was first convinced of this model over extensive reading and discussions and debate with some of its proponents a couple of years ago, I was persuaded, but I thought it was too late for this thing to succeed. I just didn't think it could go anywhere. It was too complicated. But the fact that Noel Pearson and others have been able to build consensus around this model is quite extraordinary, especially when they had a lot of hardline activists to placate along the way, who certainly wanted a racial non-discrimination clause, which was a central part of the recommendation to government from the expert panel. And they also, of course, as many of you would know, were pushing for a treaty. In my view, given that we've got a federal parliament and with the constitutional power over Indigenous affairs, including native title, it's inconceivable that we wouldn't have an Indigenous advisory body of some kind. We have one now. It's ad hoc, it's appointed by the government, it's not legislated, it could be disbanded tomorrow, and in fact it was last year for a moment, but we have one, we have that advisory body. All this constitutional proposal would do is mandate such a body to provide non-binding advice to the government on matters related to Indigenous affairs. Its membership, the manner of their selection, its functions and its funding would all be the prerogative of the Parliament, not the Constitution. So all I would say is please think about this option. Read the book The Forgotten People that was edited by Damien Freeman and Shireen Morris. I wrote the first chapter in that one, a little plug there. The Uluru statement from a couple of months ago, the statement from the heart that embraced this approach, really, I think, is an historic opportunity. The breadth and depth of Indigenous leadership that worked so hard and gave ground and compromise around this approach is remarkable. They've gone that extra yard, so I think it's incumbent upon the broader community, especially constitutional conservatives, to give it serious consideration. As I said, mandating an Indigenous advisory body strikes me as more minimalist in constitutional reform than anyone could have thought possible, but at the same time, by guaranteeing a voice for Indigenous Australians, it's more useful and meaningful than many people could have expected. Anyway, we have got plenty of time to keep discussing and considering these issues, because it doesn't strike me that our political leaders just at the moment have sufficient political capital to make any advances on constitutional reform. I think they're too busy trying to... I think they're too busy just at the moment trying to comply with the Constitution rather than to reform it. Excuse me, I'll just take a drink. I've got a bit of a lurgy. So, I am a refugee from South Australia, and I now reside in Sydney. So the other thing, and I still have a special place in my heart, of course, for South Australia, as most of us who flee South Australia do. That we used to call it the free settler state, and now we know free settler become struggling mendicant state. But it's because of that I'd especially like to also acknowledge tonight the generous taxpayers of Western Australia. Without you, my friends and extended family back in South Australia would not be fed, and my beloved Adelaide Crows would not have a packed stadium cheering full of solvent fans at their home games. And they're going to be playing in Perth here tomorrow. They run out on the ground at Subiaco. I think it's the last AFL game at Subiaco. So just remember, those of you who are going, I've already caught up with a couple of people who are, just remember that through the wonders of horizontal fiscal equalisation, West Australians are not only fielding their own team, but they're helping to fund the opposition. When I was a young reporter in South Australia, I used to repeat that glib line that the horizontal fiscal equalisation was the glue that held the Federation together. I learned it from John Bannon. Eek. The late John Bannon. I should pay my respects to John Bannon, although I did battle with him most days back in the day, as Nick Cater did as well. Now, I'm a bit older and a bit more world weary now, and I know that the reason it's called horizontal fiscal equalisation is because some states, such as my old home state, can recline lazily in horizontal positions and rely on the hard work and hard-won tax dollars of the other states. Horizontal fiscal reclining is what I call it. Now, if you've been watching what's been happening in South Australia of late, you would have noticed that they've spent up big on an unnecessary desalination plant. I think the only necessary desal plant is the one here in the west. They're mothballed in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide. More than $7 billion worth of desal plants. And the dams are full. It's just, anyway, I could go off on that. So they've built this desal plant. They've also built $500 million to upgrade the Adelaide Oval. And they've also built the most expensive hospital in South Australia. And along with that, they've gone for this, this virtue signalling climate gesture of a 50% renewable energy target, which has forced out gas generation and shut down coal generation. So to survive next summer in South Australia, at the same long hot summers that you have here, the state government there is literally sticky taping a solution together. They're shipping in diesel generators, rushing to build the world's largest battery, and they're running advertising campaigns urging people to not use too much electricity. All of this is costing taxpayers in South Australia $550 million extra. And of course, some of that money, some of that glue that is holding their electricity system together will come from Western Australia and other states. It's the cash that just holds these indolent states together. Horizontal fiscal equalisation means efficient states pay for the indulgences of states like South Australia. And in its current form, I think it's like a national institutional version of personal welfare traps, where they encourage dependence and reward indolence in our social welfare system. So this does for the states. It needs reform. But why would anyone whinge about federation and call for reform when it's working so well? Let's have a look at this well-oiled machine of federation. The city of Fremantle, just down the road, and the Yarra and Darebin councils in Victoria are railing against Australia Day. They've shifted it. They don't like it. It's our national day, and it's under attack from local government. These people seriously can't organise an efficient means to collect your rubbish. My council gives me 4 bins, 4 bins. Yet they deign to lecture us on our National Day. Now, everyone's entitled to their opinion, of course, but when it comes to Australia Day, surely the only question for local government is, will we open the library? Do we pick up the rubbish on January the 26th, or we catch up the next day? In Sydney, we saw the Marrickville Council adopt a motion, which thankfully has since been overturned, but they adopted a motion to, quote, boycott all goods made in Israel and any sporting, institutional, academic, government or institutional cultural exchanges with Israel. Now, speaking of constitutional recognition, local government isn't even recognised in the Constitution, so how did that get the power to meddle in foreign affairs? Now, I know you're all rattling through Section 51 in your minds. I know you're ahead of the game there. Clearly, I know, councils don't have responsibility for external affairs or foreign relations. As we all know, that rests with the states. I know this because on June the 22nd this year, the South Australian Parliament condemned settlement building by Israel and demanded that Australia recognise the state of Palestine. Here is a state steeped in debt with the highest unemployment rate in the land that can't keep its lights on, and I'm talking about South Australia here, not the Palestinian territories. And this state wants to dabble not just in foreign affairs, but the most intractable international quandary of the modern age. Move over, Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat, Shimon Peres. Your place in history is taken by Jay Weatherill. But, you know, it goes on. In New South Wales, the former Liberal Premier, Mike Baird, pushed for a greater refugee intake. Obviously, immigration is not listed as a federal power under Section 51 either. Baird announced free TAFE courses and public transport discounts for refugees and asylum seekers. I'm not making this up. And it gets even worse than that if you dip down to Victoria. The states seem to think they still have a responsibility for Indigenous affairs as well. Victoria has a working group on, wait for it, a treaty with Indigenous Australians. They've got a website for this project which helpfully notes 3 limitations on their aims. First is it's going to be difficult to get everyone to agree. Yeah. Second, they said, well, we operate under a state constitution, so we can only do what our constitution allows. Yeah. Third, they said, oh, actually, we're only a state, so we can't do anything for a national treaty but advocate for it. So, you don't say, Victoria. Victoria doesn't need a website and a working sheet and a working group on treaties with Indigenous Australians. It needs a federal government, and we've already got one of those. Climate policy is another area where they've overreached. It wasn't good enough for Canberra to sign Kyoto and ratify Paris and introduce a renewable energy target. The states decided to go further and set their own targets. My mate back in South Australia, Jay Weatherill, his 50% renewable energy target is the root cause of his power woes, and now Daniel Andrews in Victoria is going down that same path. These places might end up needing a little bit more money from Western Australia in the years to come, I think. If this sort of local and state government overreach isn't bad enough, we have this muddled federalism cutting the other way as well, of course, with Canberra poking its way into every crevice of national life. Just a few days ago, we saw the Prime Minister go into Sydney's Martin Place to make an announcement about bollards. Seriously, the federal government releasing policy on bollards. And I have checked, you won't find that in Section 51 either. They've also inveigled their way into the funding arrangements of every school and hospital in the country. These were and should be state responsibilities. Now every ribbon cutting at every school sees a crush of federal and state MPs claiming credit, while of course they endlessly pass the buck over any problems. Canberra's also waded into disability services, adding another massive bureaucracy to the cost of helping some of our most vulnerable. And through the RET, or the Renewable Energy Target, Canberra's taken ownership of every energy problem in the country. An area once left to the states is now another federal responsibility. And so invested is Canberra in energy now that there is serious discussion of the federal government subsidising a new coal power station. Think about this. The states take advantage of a federal subsidy scheme to overcook their renewable energy share. That sends their baseload generators broke, and they shut down their coal-fired power stations. They demolish them, in fact, in South Australia and Victoria. So then they need more federal money to help build and subsidise some backup generating capacity, and Canberra looks at spending more money on building new coal-fired power stations. It is just madness, and I know you all know there's a silver bullet here, of course, but you can't even talk about the nuclear solution because all over the nation we've got local councils who have declared themselves nuclear-free zones. Federation, we have a problem. Now, the current coalition government promised federation reform and taxation reform, but effectively they've been abandoned. They've decided that reform is too hard. And I suppose when you look at the shambles over gay marriage, you can see what they're saying. As I wrote in The Australian this morning, how can we even think about finding national consensus and political momentum on Indigenous recognition when we don't even know who among our current politicians is constitutionally eligible to sit in Parliament? And the Indigenous debate now, of course, has been steered off into ludicrous acrimony over inscriptions on statues, which has taken another bad turn for the worse in Sydney today. So what's going wrong in our national affairs? Who's to blame for this paralysis and discombobulation? The public... I've never been heckled before in a speech. They told me you guys were conservative and you heckle. No, of course, the public blames the politicians blame each other, and the media blames the public. I want to take a leaf out of Donald Trump's book and place at least some of the blame with the media. Fake news has become a pretty emotive and elusive term these days, I'll concede. It can mean just about anything, depending on your point of view, from deliberately fabricated online stories to news or commentary you just disagree with. But for all of his obvious faults, flaws, eccentricities and inconsistencies, Trump is right in much of his criticism of the media. They are out of touch with mainstream concerns, and they are jaundiced and deceptive in their coverage of him and many of the issues he strongly identifies with. Trump knows the media are less trusted than even the politicians, and he's shown that he can triumph by going to war with them. This is part of the reason Trump won. He identified the chasm between the media political elite and challenged it on behalf of a disenchanted mainstream. And when CNN was caught out leaking debate questions to Hillary Clinton, it just confirmed Trump's conspiracy theory. And when Clinton called half of Trump's supporters racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic basket of deplorables, she confirmed the establishment's disdain for the very voters whose support they're trying to win. But if you listen up and you watch out, you see the same thing happening in Australia. When politicians and journalists talk about dog whistling tactics, they are expressing a belief that mainstream voters are xenophobic and gullible enough to be rallied by racist undertones. When they over-egg a reaction to Pauline Hanson's burqa stunt, calling the stunt appalling and dubbing the burqa a religious garment, they suddenly find themselves supporting a tool of female oppression that even most Muslims reject. And then they wonder why mainstream voters think that politicians are either out of touch or sneering at them, or probably both. One of the things I'm most critical of in the media, particularly the political media, the Canberra Press Gallery and those aligned to them in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney, especially the publicly funded broadcasters. Oh, Ian, I just have to mention that I did work at the ABC for a little while, yes, and it was a fact-finding mission. But it's particularly this group, this political media elite. It's the Canberra Press Gallery, and it's those big institutions in Melbourne and Sydney who are a separate category of media in my mind. They're completely different to the journalists you deal with around the rest of the country. And the problem, their main weakness is their groupthink. They see things through the same political prism. There are articles of faith that they seldom disagree on. They love a climate gesture. They favour open borders. They're fanatical about gay marriage. I've dubbed them in the past the love media, and it's a term that's kind of stuck. It wasn't a very imaginative or original term because I just did it in response to Bob Brown calling the Murdoch media the hate media. But it does seem kind of apt because they want to be loved by their colleagues and the politically correct crowd. And most of their reporting and commentary reflects that desire, in my view. I think they need to be a bit more prepared to live a prickly life on behalf of the mainstream views and values of their audiences, who, in the case of the public broadcasters, happen to be the taxpayers who fund them. One of the common views you'll find shared among the love media is an attitude towards federation. Unsurprisingly, given they all sit up on Capitol Hill there, they tend to be centralists. They don't think much of states' rights or competitive federalism, and they support Canberra sticking its nose into just about anything. The media echo what is really a cross-partisan political consensus that all wisdom and virtue resides in Canberra. Journalists in the political debate tend to suffer from a kind of Stockholm syndrome. They're trapped by the politicians in a never-ending partisan debate. They're held hostage to the news cycle, and they end up wanting to please their captors. And many of the politicians do the same, falsely believing that their KPIs are all about winning media adulation. They become captives to the media agenda. Once you throw in the academics and the bureaucrats, you have an enormously influential media political class, all more or less isolated from the mainstream voters they're supposed to serve. They're self-referential, self-serving, self-obsessed. They actually think, this is true, they actually think that social media is their connection to the masses. In fact, as you'll know, many of you will know, especially on Twitter, social media is an unrepresentative, disrespectful, ignorant echo chamber of the Green left. And it's where voters are derided, actually. Mainstream voters are derided, Clinton-like, as deplorables. It makes the social media, surprisingly, we're supposed to democratise the media, it makes this disconnect between the mainstream and the media political class even worse. The very geography of our national capital accentuates all this. It accentuates this disconnect. Canberra sits up there, naturally enough, in rarefied atmosphere. It's a purpose-built capital, isolated from ports, transport hubs, industry, overplanned, inorganic, recession-proof, and with no reason for existence beyond sustaining itself and lording it over the rest of us. I've written a fair bit about this great chasm, this great Australian divide, and it's not an entirely new tendency, nor is it confined to Australia. Oscar Wilde once wrote that by giving us the opinions of the uneducated, journalism keeps us in touch with the ignorance of the community. And I fear that too many journalists think this is the truth and behave accordingly. It's this disconnect that enabled journalists in the US and around the world to underestimate Trump. And when they got it wrong, they didn't apologise for their mistakes. No, they blamed the voters. In The Guardian Australia, Catherine Murphy put it this way: a person with manifest disdain for facts and evidence now occupies the White House because half the country didn't care. That's the view from the media political class. There is another view, and that is that presented with two lamentable candidates, voters opted for the lesser evil, or at least one that would shake up the establishment and didn't see them as deplorable. We've seen so many examples in Australia where the media political class have got it wrong and the mainstream have gotten it right. Border protection to me stands out as the classic example. Strong border protection was attacked mercilessly by the love media under the Howard government. They cheered when Labor opened the borders up. Then when the boats started arriving, they were muted in their criticism of Labor. Remember, even the Human Rights Commission President Gillian Triggs secretly decided to delay an inquiry. Then when it got really bad, Labor told the journalists that the influx of boats was driven by push factors and could not be stopped. Now, this was manifestly nonsense, even at the time, because we'd seen what Howard had done. But the Love media duly adopted and made this fake news argument. Then when the coalition said it would turn boats back, remember, before they got into government, Kevin Rudd said, no, this would start a conflict with Indonesia. Again, the media just echoed this as if it was self-evident. And through all of the twists and turns, the Love media followed Labor's cues and denounced the coalition approach. They still do it now. And they've been wrong at every turn. There's not a scintilla of consistency in their position, except that they've been wrong at every step. But the public have always been right. The public, if you look at opinion polls and election results, the public have always understood the importance of secure borders and orderly migration. There are many other examples where the political media class have got it wrong like that, and the mainstream have got it right. I think Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, her carbon tax, and live cattle exports were classic, live cattle export ban. Also in New South Wales, you would have seen the Baird government's greyhound racing ban. These were all cheered by the left and the media, but recognised as madness by the majority of the public. The media political class can easily convince itself of its truthiness and have it reinforced constantly by independent and social media, but it can't fool the public. That's the real message of the fake news age, and the public has the ultimate say through the ballot box. Now, the big problem coming up, I think, with this dynamic of fake news, federalism and the Love media is that it is getting worse, and it's going to continue to get worse. It's going to become an even more insidious influence on our national debate. Too much of our national debate is generated, controlled, filtered through the prism of that Canberra, Sydney, Melbourne axis. It's given that Canberra bubble and the inner city so-called elites of Sydney and Melbourne a disproportionate say in our national debate. It means the Canberra Press Gallery and the huge garrisons of publicly funded journalists at Ultimo in Sydney and South Bank in Melbourne dominate our national discussion at the expense. And they do this, they dominate the discussion at the expense of Perth, Geraldton, Adelaide, Geelong, wherever else you like to mention. It's why we constantly see, hear and read journalists, politicians and commentators referring to Western Sydney as if it's a foreign country. Sometimes they do this when they're sitting in a studio at Ultimo, 15 kilometres down the M4 from Western Sydney. And we hear the media and political class talk about people out there, as if referring to people living beyond civilization, or at least beyond the smashed avocado belt. And they talk about dog whistling tactics deployed out there as if people in the regions and smaller cities are somehow more gullible, more xenophobic and more unsavoury than the media political class. The centralised media clique in Canberra and inner city Sydney and Melbourne dictates the political conversation for a federation which in the main has more grounded values and priorities. In the suburbs and the regions, people are aspirational, they value work, and they want to ensure their children do better than they've done. They tend to display, in my view, a kind of matter of fact or live and let live approach to the issues, the big social issues of the day, and they value cheap energy over climate gestures, and they've got a very practical attitude to border protection and orderly immigration. But in the Love media, where the national debate is dominated, it's all about identity politics, climate gestures, virtue signalling, and post-material concerns. If you don't believe me, pour yourself a strong drink on Monday night, sit down and watch Q&A. And here's the rub. This centralism, this diminution of the voice of the states and the regions when it comes to our national discussion is being accentuated as we speak by structural changes in the media. I don't normally quote the Journalists' Union, but their chief, Paul Murphy, told a parliamentary inquiry just a few weeks ago that 2,500 journalist jobs have disappeared in the past 6 years. That's an astonishingly large number. That's enough journalists, 2,500 journalists gone in the last 6 years. It's enough journalists to staff, say, 25 reasonably sized daily newspapers, perhaps 150 television newsrooms, maybe 300 radio newsrooms. And it probably represents about a third of the journalists we've got working today. And my point about these jobs disappearing is that they did not go from the Canberra Press Gallery or from Ultimo or from South Bank. The Press Gallery numbers are still at about 250 journalists, still higher than they were in the 1980s when fewer than 200 journalists worked out of Parliament House. And as you know, in recent years, the ABC has continued to expand, and all the while it's concentrated more and more, a higher proportion of its workforce in Ultimo and South Bank, fewer and fewer in the regions. So proportionately, as the state-based and regional journalism jobs disappear, the weighting of this media political class, the love media, the journalists in Canberra and Sydney and Melbourne continues to grow. As the broader media workforce shrinks, the ultra-politically correct media cohort becomes more dominant. This is the reverse federalism of the Australian media. It means that state governments come under less scrutiny and because from the shrinking state-based journalistic pools. It means regional consumers receive less local news and analysis and more of what Sydney and Canberra deems important. And we actually need journalists. And I'm no, as you might have guessed, I'm no great defender of journalists per se, but we actually need journalists in the regions and the state capitals. We need them to serve their communities by providing local stories and accountability and local insight on national issues. But just as vitally, we need them as conduits between the mainstream Australia and this media political class. It's a two-way process. Crucially and sadly, the current disproportionate decline of state-based and regional media means the views of an Esperance fisherman or an Eyre Peninsula farmer or a Geelong small businessman, a Penrith hairdresser, they're far less likely to find their way into the national conversation. The gap between the so-called elites, the media political class, and the mainstream can only widen. The love media will be becoming comparatively louder. This leads to less responsive governments, less patient electorates, less perceptive media, more acrimony, and a less productive democracy. And where's the proof, you might ask? Where's my field evidence? That's easy, ladies and gentlemen. Just ask you to look outside at the political shambles in Australia today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful speech. I'm not going to speak about your comments on Indigenous recognition because I want to focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. But I will send you a copy of the IPA's booklet, Race Has No Place. My name is John Roscombe. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and it's my great pleasure to move the vote of thanks for Chris this evening. Before I do that, I want to acknowledge all the members of the Society, the many members of the IPA that are here, two IPA directors, Harold Clough and Michael Foley, who are here, and of course Senator James Patterson, the former Executive Director of the IPA. If I can say, James, I've never been more proud of you than to defend the Constitution, to defend federalism, and to very gently and politely point out to the former Prime Minister today that nearly nothing he said was conservative. On the 25th anniversary of the Society that we've commemorated, I want to recognise a person whose name has come up a lot over these last few days and will come up in the High Court in coming weeks and months, and that is, of course, the wonderful Brian Pape, who's been such and was such a large part of the success of the Samuel Griffith Society. And it's wonderful to have so many young people here today, and what Ron Manners does and what Mancal Foundation does is very, very special. Chris, Chris, as he pointed out, is a South Australian, which is why he spoke for 144% of his allotted time. I'm a Victorian, but in spirit I'm a West Australian, which is why I'll only speak for 34% of my allotted time. As you saw tonight, Chris is an incisive, acute, perceptive observer of our condition in Australia at the moment. I didn't need to do much research to prepare for this evening because I just had to go to my phone and scroll through the texts that I send Chris seemingly every week on his articles saying, "Great piece, wonderful piece, gee, I hope Malcolm reads this. Gee, I hope Tony reads this." And when Chris's comments, articles get something like 700, 800, 900 comments at a time, you know he is striking a chord and speaking for us. His work on Sky has dramatically improved the condition of the Roscombe family of a weeknight, because I can go to bed having watched Chris and having agreed with every single thing he said. And in the bad old days, we only had late line. Thank you, Chris. Chris commented about his article today, just taking the first sentence of his piece that appeared in the Australian today, I think just demonstrates what an acute observer and what a wordsmith Chris is. He wrote, "In postmodern Australia, we are so caught up in self-loathing, introspection and post-colonial revisionism that we have become discombobulated, unable or unwilling to take advantage of our incomparable achievements." Well said, Chris. I think Chris's background has uniquely equipped him to be the acute observer that he is. The president of the society mentioned that Chris studied journalism. Before he was a journalist, he of course studied wildlife management. And I think that has uniquely equipped him to spot the greenies in that World Heritage listed national park that you could never mine uranium in. Chris has done some very important work. He's forensically documented and highlighted for the public what I think is one of the greatest threats to Australian liberty that we face, Gillian Triggs. He's been an indefatigable opponent of that organisation that we just referred to by 3 letters, the first of which is an A. It's an organisation that has its tentacles everywhere, seemingly in every part of our life. It's staffed by social justice warriors, and it adopts every progressive, left-wing, politically correct campaign that happens to be trendy at the time. And I'm talking about the AFL. Chris is compassionate. Chris works with some of the most disadvantaged young people in our community. These are young people who are unlikely ever to get gainful employment, and they face a life of unemployment and welfare. I'm talking about journalism students. Earlier this month, Chris visited Macleay College that studies journalism, and I think Chris was as brave going to Macleay College as he was coming to the Samuel Griffith Society to talk about Indigenous recognition. Chris was interviewed by a Jamil Khan, who described himself as a Muslim-born half Pakistani, so he's not into identity politics, who genuinely views the ABC as being one of Australia's most credible news sources. He writes in the record of his interview that took place with Chris a few weeks ago, "I found that I despised most of Chris's views." And then he says, "But how did my conversation with Chris go?" And he wrote, "Really well. Did he change my opinions? No. But due to his intelligence and his conviction, I had newfound respect for the man. Thank you, Chris, for showing me respect. while eloquently articulating your views. And that's what we saw from Chris tonight. Chris confronts the big issues: culture, immigration, the future of the West, climate change. Speaking personally, I think some of Chris's work this year talking about the Great Bill Leak was especially moving. Tonight, what I got out of Chris's comments were two things. First, the emergence of the political class. And it's a class, as you described, Chris, that combines politics, the media, into one group that creates an echo chamber of groupthink. And what you've especially done, knowing and working for the coalition as long as you have, is to identify in your columns that this applies to the coalition, particularly when you think that the coalition at the federal level has won 6 of the last 8 federal elections and drawn 1, and yet you wouldn't know it. So, Chris, I got that out of tonight. The other thing that I got out of tonight was the way you analysed the importance of the Australian public, the disdain that the media and political elites have for us as a community, and exactly as you said, when people don't understand real people, when they don't understand the dreams and aspirations of real people, they will miss Trump. They will miss Brexit. They are missing whole changes in the Australian population at the moment. And exactly as you said, there's nothing more damaging and dangerous than the disdain for democracy that I think we are facing, and you put that so eloquently. I'm going to finish in the spirit of bipartisanship, and I'm going to quote what Jamil said at the end of his article, because it applies to what you said tonight to us, Chris, to the Society. Jamil said, "Thank you for a truly enriching experience." Can I ask you to thank Chris Kenny?